Hello and welcome to the Bucknuts Happy Hour, Buckeye fans. I'm Patrick Murphy with Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports here with you. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're coming off of a big Buckeye win against Penn State on the road. We're going to get into some of that. We've got Purdue coming up this weekend at home. We'll get into a little bit of that, not as much as we would for some of the other games. And we've got the college football playoff rankings, the first ones that just came out on Tuesday night that we're going to talk about as well. So a lot to talk about, a lot of good vibes for the Buckeyes, which I'm going to be honest, going into last weekend, I did not know if that would be the case. Unfortunately, because of some scheduling and we have interviews tonight and things like that, I don't have a beer for this happy hour. So we're going to do this one completely sober, but it'll keep me alert for interviews tonight. But it should still be a good show. So I want to start with the college football playoff rankings. And to do that, I'm going to bring in my friend, 24/7 Sports colleague, Brad Crawford. Brad, how are we doing today?
Doing well, man. I can accurately say that our final playoff projection Monday morning was the same exact 12 teams the committee had on Tuesday night. Not the same seeding maybe, but same 12 teams. So we have a pretty good idea, man, of where this thing's headed.
Yeah. Before we get into that, I just want to get quickly your insight on the Buckeyes. Obviously, lose to Oregon, off week, Nebraska, and then go to Penn State and get a win. They are number 2 in the playoff rankings. We'll talk about that, but just kind of your outside opinion. We've done this before when you've come on the show. What do you make of this team that I know you picked to win the national championship before the season?
I did. Coming out of that early season loss at Oregon, that following Monday, 48 hours after that game, I still had Ohio State higher rated than Oregon in my power rankings because I think the Buckeyes in that game, they didn't necessarily get outplayed. They gave up some big plays, but they simply ran out of time. I mean, Will Howard's a first down away from likely setting up for a game-winning field goal try, and then the complete narrative is totally different. Here we are November 6th. So I think it's very interesting. We talk about resumes this time of year. Ohio State has that elite win now at Penn State. Doesn't have any more super good wins, but I think the two results that matter are the win over the Nittany Lions and that 1-point loss at Oregon. No other team this season has played Oregon as well as Ohio State did. Boise did lose by 3. That was early. But I think Oregon is even better right now than when they played Ohio State. So I do think, Pat, that we're going to see a rematch of that game here in a couple of weeks in Bloomington. But Ohio State still has some games it needs to win, notably Indiana next weekend.
Yeah, two weekends. But
2 weekends,
yeah. We'll get back to the Buckeyes in Oregon and kind of where everything stands in the rankings. The first thing I wanted to ask you about the rankings, though, is I see a lot of this, be it from friends of mine, people on our message board, people on social media. It's like, well, these rankings don't matter. These first rankings don't matter. And I often push back on that because I think you can learn a lot about the committee through these rankings and how things will shape up. As you said, the projections were near perfect. So from your eyes, why does it matter to pay attention to this first rankings when we're still several weeks away from what will be the final rankings and the college football playoff field?
Yeah, I think it does matter because unless a lot of these top 5 or 6 teams truly tank these next 3 to 4 weeks, we're already seeing sort of built-in, I wouldn't want to say biases, but built-in hype for these, like I said, 5 or 6 teams. Miami's a big winner last night, unbeaten and number 4 in the rankings despite not having any good wins this season. Maybe one, I guess you could say, a 3-loss Louisville team. That's Miami's best win. But then Indiana and BYU, both those teams are unbeaten, yet they're 5 and 6 spots behind the Canes. Yeah. So that shows me, for whatever reason, Ward Manuel, Michigan's AD, and the new playoff chair said last night, he was asked, why is Miami 5 spots higher than projected Big 12 champ BYU in the rankings? And he said, well, Miami's offense is pretty explosive. I mean, that's a subjective take as they come. So I think we do see some built-in biases already. And Miami's a team at number 4, Pat, that I see, since they're ranked there right now, they could lose a game over the next couple of weeks and still get in the playoff. And if the ACC is a 2-bid league, then we talk about possibly a 4th SEC or 4th Big Ten team getting left out.
Yeah, Yeah, that's certainly possible. All right, well, let's get into Ohio State. You mentioned it. Ohio State and Oregon, top two teams in the country. I think from our perspective, the kind of narrative, everyone expected Oregon to be number one. It was a bit surprising for me with Ohio State above Georgia. I thought Ohio State would probably slot in at 3. The committee members were asked, or Ward Manuel was asked about that quite a bit on the conference call, and basically cited that loss at Oregon that you mentioned. How do you see those top 3 teams right now? And do you think the committee got it right in that ranking, or does it really matter because it'll play out eventually anyway?
Yeah, I think whether Ohio State was 2 or 3 on Tuesday night, that part doesn't matter. But it does show me that the committee respects the Buckeyes. I think even a 10-win Ohio State team likely gets in. Certainly an Ohio State team that gets back to Indy to face Oregon in the Big Ten title game is going to get in regardless of what happens there at that stadium. But for me, I wanted to see where Georgia was ranked because we sort of put Georgia and Ohio State on the same pedestal with matching records, one-loss teams. However, Georgia was down 4 touchdowns to Alabama in its loss, and Oregon, Ohio State was nip and tuck the entire way. So the committee really does think highly of the Buckeyes, and I think rightfully so. They went on the road just before that first ranking and posted one of the nation's top wins of the year.
Do you think they got it right in your eyes, having watched both these teams? I know Georgia has had some closer than probably expected wins as well, which didn't come up really on the call. But obviously their win against Texas on the road based on the rankings is a better win than Ohio State's at Penn State. So do you think they got it right in this instance?
I think they did. Quarterback play for both teams hasn't exactly been elite, but Will Howard's turning it over a lot less than Carson Beck. He had 3 picks at Texas, and he had 3 interceptions in Saturday's win over Florida. So right now, Georgia, has a quarterback issue.
As you look at the way that the field would break down if we started right now, and I know people are still kind of getting used to this new system, the top 4 conference winners will get those top 4 spots in terms of the rankings. So, Ohio State doesn't necessarily slot in at number 2. Right now, they'd be number 5. I've seen a lot of people say that as it's sort of playing out now, that the 5 seed, despite playing an extra game, might even be a better spot just because of the matchups that you would get. What say you on that opinion?
Yeah, it depends on the matchup for Ohio State. If they're the 5 seed, they would play the 12, which is likely the G5 champion, Boise State. And, I don't think Jim Knowles wants to necessarily invite Ashton Jeanty to a Christmas party. He's going to probably win the Heisman this season, so that's a tough matchup anyway. But then Ohio State would next play the 4 seed, which would be either Miami or BYU. Now, I do like Boise State versus Ohio State first round, Ohio Stadium playoff home game. Ohio State's probably a 2-touchdown favorite in that game and probably would be favored the following week too, in my opinion, against Miami or BYU. Miami and BYU, Pat, neither of those teams have played a team as talented as Ohio State and won't until the playoffs. So I do agree that maybe the 5 seed is where Ohio State wants to be. But I know Ryan Day wants to beat Oregon, and he wants to win the Big Ten championship too.
Yeah, there's certainly, that was one of the goals they set out with at the beginning of the season was winning the Big Ten championship. And I think that time off is valuable for every team. But as you mentioned, the advantage of having a home game, what do you make of kind of, as you see this playoff bracket start to take shape, some of the matchups we could get on campuses and kind of just from a college football perspective, how exciting some of those could be in towns that don't always get some of these type of matchups?
Indiana at Tennessee, possibility in the first round. That'd be awesome, right? Kirk Cignetti against Josh Heupel. Last man with the ball wins. That'd be a brutal matchup for Indiana, by the way, solely because Tennessee is one of those Jekyll and Hyde teams that plays just lights out at Neyland Stadium. And then on the road, Tennessee can barely score after watching the last few years. That'd be an awesome game. Maybe if Ohio State were to get the 6 seed instead of the 5, Boise State at Texas would be very interesting. Texas right now is my projected SEC runner-up. In the 10-7 game, maybe we have Notre Dame at Penn State, maybe Penn State at Notre Dame, depending on how those teams finish. So I do think the Big Ten is in really good position right now to get 4 teams in. I think an 11-1 Indiana with a loss to Ohio State here in a couple weeks, my projection. I do think the Hoosiers get in with 11 wins. The only way that wouldn't happen, though, is if the Big 12 is a two-bid league. I don't see that happening. Or if SMU beats Miami in the ACC, then SMU would get the auto bid, and Miami would probably get an at-large at 12-1 over Indiana.
Since you brought up Indiana, we'll go there now. I'm sure Buckeye fans at this point, listening, watching this, have watched the Hoosiers play, and certainly they have gained some respect across the country. What has Cignetti brought to this team in your eyes, and why is this all of a sudden going from a school that really has had one good season in 2020 in the last however many years to being a team that we're talking about for the Big Ten and in the college football playoff? Yeah,
this roster is completely new. So, all the holdovers from last season, few of them that they are, they don't know what losing feels like. These are all new guys at Indiana. Indiana football could have won 11 games last year, and these new players, wouldn't have known. So I think he certainly has changed the culture quickly. That happens with a brand new roster. He's done a good job of instilling confidence in this offense. Every week, man, we're talking about game control being one of the factors the committee looks at. Indiana blows out its opponents. 47 unanswered on the road against Michigan State. Michigan State's probably a bowl team this season, and I know they're not a world beater with Aiden Childs at quarterback, but 47 points unanswered is pretty impressive. They also won 2 games without Curtis Rourke at quarterback, the starter there. So Indiana is a legitimate 9-0 team. I know they have not beaten a top 25 team in the committee's eyes yet, but I will say this. Do not look ahead to the Ohio State game if you're an Indiana fan. You still got to beat Michigan. Sharon Moore and Michigan, they're bad this season. I realize that, and they can't score. But Davis Warren's playing a little bit better, and this is the best defense Indiana has faced talent-wise all year.
Yeah, I forget exactly. I looked this up the other day. Michigan and Indiana. Indiana won in 2020 during the COVID year, but since then, you have to go back to, I think it is 1987. So similar. Ohio State, Indiana hasn't beat Ohio State, I think, since 88, 89, something like that. But kind of similar there. I do think you make a good point about this being a whole new roster as we'll head into that game in a couple weeks. They don't know that Indiana loses to the Buckeyes every year, right?
Right.
So I think that does make that game a bit more interesting. But as you look at the top, well, let's just look at the whole rankings as they come out. Was there a major surprise for you, be it in the top 12 or elsewhere in these rankings?
Yeah, big surprise for me was BYU at number 9. I had them much higher. I thought they would be bordering on a top 5 seed and not a, number 9 or 10 seed. That's kind of crazy to me. Tennessee, Pat, I think they're vastly overrated at 7-1, number 7. They beat Alabama, and they don't have any more wins over ranked teams. That's it. Had a bad loss at Arkansas. Bama's a team that I think at 6-2 right now should not be ranked 11th. And I think part of the reason Missouri is still ranked at the back end of the top 25 is just to beefing up Alabama's resume. The committee does this every time. They put some crazy team that's not deserving of a bid somewhere in the high 20s just so the team in the teens looks better because they have a win over them. So a little bit surprised South Carolina, 3-loss team, is not ranked. Louisville, another 3-loss team, is ranked. That was kind of my takeaways from the first ranking.
Yeah, and I remember, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, the committee chair being asked about that exact example you just said, where why is this team ranked? Is it just to help out another team? And they pushed back, but it's pretty clear, right? I mean,
right.
The first team that came up was Missouri last night on ESPN, and I was also, like you just said, I was surprised that they were still in the rankings. And I have a future father-in-law who's a big Mizzou fan, so I pay attention to them a little bit. And I don't think he would tell you they're a top 25 team, much less. Yeah, go ahead.
They lost. They were down 5 touchdowns on the road to A&M at one point. Lost that game by 30. Did not score a point at Bama against a Bama team, like I said, that's not elite this season, 34-0. And they have a quarterback injury to Brady Cook. So I'm not sure right now why Missouri is still ranked. I was happy to see Colorado in there, still have an outside shot at the Big 12. And then Army. 8-0 Army's number 25. There is a small chance that the G5 gets 2 teams in if Boise wins out and Army does as well.
Well, that would be interesting. Not something I think most of us would have projected coming in. Is there a team outside the top 12 that you think people should have an eye on in terms of maybe climbing in and being in the ranking or in the field for the playoff?
Yeah, I think SMU at number 13, and I believe it's Iowa State at, I want to say they're 17 right now. I still think Iowa State can win the Big 12. I don't think that's going to be a multi-team league unless BYU maybe gets to that championship game 12-0 and loses a close game to Iowa State. But Iowa State's a team that beat Iowa this year on the road. Iowa's probably going to go 9-3 because they have a favorable schedule by Big Ten standards. And SMU at 13. I mean, SMU still controls its own destiny despite being that first team out right now. You know, we use all these kind of March Madness terminology now that we have a college football expanded playoff. It's kind of cool, you know, writing stories and talking each week about these first 4 out and the next 4 after that. But I think there's maybe 18 teams, Pat, that are still in the mix for those 12 spots. And if you're past number 19 right now, really, unless you're Army, you have no shot.
Okay. Do you like the way that the format is in terms of the top 4 conference champions getting those spots? I was talking as we drove back from Penn State this weekend about it with some of our guys, and it was kind of like, in the future, there could be a team that maybe doesn't necessarily deserve that just happens to win their championship. I don't know if that happens this year, but just what are your thoughts on kind of how the way that this is formatted?
I like the 5 auto bid and 7 at-large setup, but I do not like the fact that the top 4 seeds must be conference champions. Yeah. I mean, because, you know, there's a scenario if there were 2 – I mean, if Oregon, Ohio State, if Oregon's 12-0, Ohio State's 11-1, if those are 2 of the 4 best teams in the country, then they should be inside the top 4, right? Why put a team at number 5? But I'll say this too. I mean, there's athletic directors out there who can't wait to have a home game in December as well. And when you play that sort of extra conference championship game, there's going to be some teams too that maybe did not make it to their title game, maybe Texas, maybe Georgia, who are happy to have a week off. So I like the format right now. I don't like the scenario in which, you know, we're going from 4 home games and then the top 4 seeds play at bowl sites. What if those top 4 seeds wanted a home game?
Yeah.
They're going to change it up here in the next few years. I know we're at 12 teams through 2025.
Do you think it stays at 12 teams?
No way.
What's Brad Crawford's ideal college football playoff look like?
I think starting in 2026, we're going to see 16 teams, and I think there's going to be a backdoor deal between the SEC, Big Ten, and ESPN where the SEC and Big Ten are going to have guaranteed slots each season in addition to those 2 leagues as conference champions. So I think we're going to see 4 auto bids for the SEC, 4 for the Big Ten, and then you're going to have 6 others, you know, vying for spots. We're going to 16 in 2 years.
If that is the case, do they put that out there that they get 4, or is that something that happens quietly in your mind?
No, I think that'll leak and get out there. Okay. The SEC and Big Ten are the 2 heavyweights right now who are more or less controlling all of this. We know ESPN controls bowl season, pretty much chooses where teams go, you know, outside of the playoff, but it's going to be a very interesting next couple of years when these ADs and university presidents go back to the bargaining table because, I mean, I can't wait to see the revenue numbers, Pat, and about 2 months from now we see, you know, the TV ratings come in from this playoff.
Sort of an outside question that just popped into my head, but the thought coming into the season from some people was that having the 12-team playoff would diminish some of these games in the regular season. I've now been at 2 of these top 5 games, and it doesn't feel like it's diminished it. I know how upset Ohio State was walking off the field at Oregon, and I have the same feeling about Penn State players walking off the field last weekend. What's your sense watching all these games? How do you feel like it has affected the regular season?
I think it's going to diminish things more when we get to that first weekend in December, conference championship games, because in talking to coaches, I don't think conference championship game is necessarily top priority anymore. I mean, I know Nick Saban stepped away recently, but he'd probably be just as happy this season leading Bama to a playoff berth inside the top 6 or 7 than he would be winning the SEC. Because, I mean, Kirby Smart, ultimately, he's getting paid to win national titles at Georgia, not conference championships. And the same goes for Ryan Day. I mean, if Oregon beats Ohio State for a second time in Indy, what if the Ducks and Buckeyes play in a semifinal game a month later and Ryan Day wins that one? Then nobody cares about the first 2 losses to the Ducks. So it's going to be very interesting, Pat, to see in the next few years and this playoff coming up here in the next month, how many of these regular season matchups are we going to see as repeats? Georgia, Texas play again, maybe. Do Bama, Georgia play again? We're going to see something happen. I mean, it's going to be an SEC Big Ten final, I think.
What about rivalry weekend, that last weekend of the regular season? Do you think it could affect that in the future in terms of, Auburn, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, those type of games where one team may be locked in pretty much to the conference championship game in the playoff? That's the only thing I can't imagine a situation where Ohio State players are like, we're going to sit out the Michigan game, but you look at the NFL and it happens last week of the regular season. Could that be a place where things start to change a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago, South Carolina snapped Clemson's 39-game home winning streak, and that essentially knocked Clemson out of the playoff, despite Clemson already knowing they were playing for a conference championship that following weekend. Yeah. That was the 4-team bracket. So in 12, Clemson's safe. So I think it does, if you beat your rival, of course your fan base is going to love it. And college football's most passionate fans are going to love rivalry weekend, no matter the records and no matter the stakes. But, yeah, I think it does certainly lose some of its luster. I mean, if Alabama beats LSU this weekend, Hugh Freeze could salvage his season if he wins the Iron Bowl for Auburn and knocks DeBoer from the playoff in his first season.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I think I am, coming into it, I was a little worried about some of these games. As I said, I've seen that it hasn't been a big issue, and I'm excited looking at some of these matchups for what we've got in store. Brad, thanks for joining us. I wanted to get some insight on the playoff from a more national perspective, so I appreciate you hopping on. I know it's a busy time of the year for you, so thank you very much for your time.
Always fun, man. Hopefully seeing you soon in a playoff setting.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.
All right. Thanks to Brad Crawford for joining us here. I think Brad gives good perspective on stuff like that. He is as dialed in as anyone on these rankings, the 12-team playoff, all of that stuff. So if you don't pay attention to Brad's work over at 24/7 Sports and CBS Sports, I recommend doing it if you are, a college football junkie like I expect most of you are. Okay, now I want to turn our attention to the Ohio State Penn State game. I know it's been talked about a lot, but I just have some thoughts that I wanted to get out, some of which I've written about already, some of which I will, are newer thoughts, kind of coming out of the press conference this week and things like that. First, I've been asked a few times, so I'll bring this up, like, what was the biggest thing in this game for me? And I guess there are 2 things that I would point to. Well, really 3, but 2 and 3 can be tied together. The first thing is just like what this game meant for Ohio State. And I know that Ohio State's beaten Penn State 8 straight times, and that this kind of, not that it feels inevitable. I mean, obviously if you paid attention last week, I picked Penn State to win. I think there were a lot of Buckeye fans going into the game that were pretty nervous about what was going to happen at Beaver Stadium. I know there were some Buckeye fans that weren't nervous because Penn State hadn't really played anybody and the track record there. But getting this top 5 win, especially after the way the Oregon game ended, I think was so big for this team. If not for, playoff rankings and things like that, I think the emotional aspect of it. I was on the field in the fourth quarter at Beaver Stadium. You're allowed to go down for media with 5 minutes left in the game. And I went down at the beginning of, or early on in Ohio State's final drive. So I was down the field for most of that. And first of all, the players on the field, Will Howard picks up that first 3rd down run, the design quarterback run, and he's up and he's fist pumping. And, obviously this meant a ton to him, and teammates are coming over, and the game wasn't even won yet. They still needed another first down. And then he gets the first down again on the next third down, and it was the same level of emotion. And then Buckeyes take the knee, and it was a party on that field for the Buckeyes. And, yes, they shook hands, they did all that, but fired up. Also in the stands, the cheers from the Ohio State fans were noticeable in that stadium. And that's true in a lot of places, but as loud as that place was, I mean, it got so quiet when Ohio State got those first downs, and like things were setting in for the Penn State fans at Beaver Stadium, a record crowd at Beaver Stadium, by the way. And then the Ohio State fans getting loud, cheering for those plays. You could just feel that emotion. And then the Buckeyes all come over to I think it was the south end zone, whatever end zone the Ohio State fans were in. Most of the Ohio State fans were in, and just kind of the celebration. It was different than pretty much any regular season game I can imagine. I can remember, the Michigan game. I didn't cover 1 versus 2, but the Michigan game with Curtis Samuel scoring the touchdown in overtime, that was a similar level. But this, it clearly just, the Buckeyes at least felt that this proved something, that especially the way it ended. And I'll get to that in a second, but it mattered to them. And, I don't think they care if anyone else thinks this game mattered, or that, whether this was, Penn State could lose 3 more games. I still think Ohio State will look back on this as a game that really made a difference in terms of where the season was going. And Ryan Day talked about after the game. He called it a crossroads. If Ohio State loses that game, your 2 losses in the Big Ten, you're almost certainly not going to the Big Ten championship game. You're still very much in the college football playoff mix, but not in the position you wanted to be as a top 4 team, and maybe even top 5. You're probably like 7, 8, depending on how it works. So things change drastically for you if you lose that game. And so to win it meant a lot. And, I was listening to some national radio afterwards, and I feel like people downplayed that, and probably because it just felt like, oh, it's Penn State again. Buckeyes win at Happy Valley, or in Happy Valley, no big deal. But this was different than other Penn State games. I honestly think this is the best Penn State team James Franklin's had. We'll see how it plays out the rest of the season. But, Penn State doesn't play Michigan. Penn State's scheduled the rest of the way. Let me pull that up here. I believe, if I remember correctly, pretty winnable. Yeah, Washington at home this weekend, at Purdue, at Minnesota, Maryland. So this should be a 1-loss Penn State team heading into the college football playoff, and we'll see what they do from there. But I do think that was something that really mattered for this team. I know it is. I watched how fired up these guys were about it, and I hope you as a Buckeye fan enjoyed that too, because all the talk of Ryan Day not being able to win the big game, and 2-7 record, top 5. And I think, if we get to another situation where we're talking about Ryan Day's record against top 5 teams, people will downplay this because it's Penn State and they drop out of the top 5 after that. Don't let that happen. This was as much of a top 5 win as that Oregon game would have been, as, pick your other games. I know some of them were in the Big Ten championship game, or the college football playoff. But Michigan, any of those, this was as big of a win as any of those. And a second thing taking out of it was the way that I mentioned this a little bit, the way the Buckeyes did it. This was not, Penn State collapsing, though I do think you could question some of James Franklin's play calls, or Andy Colknetti. I think I got that right. Their offensive coordinators' play calls on the goal line situations. You moved an ineligible offensive lineman in motion, but there just wasn't a lot of creativity there. But Ohio State still had to get that stop, and to do that on the goal line after you've heard about the defense and the struggles from the Oregon game, and then people doubting whether or not the improvements were real against Nebraska. This was huge for them in that capacity. And then to cap it by going 5 minutes and 13 seconds with 10 plays all on the ground, with an offensive line 11 plays all on the ground with an offensive line that was featuring a guy starting at left tackle for the first time and a guy starting at left guard for the first time. That is, Ryan Day. And I think that the conversation about toughness has gone too far about this team. Like, yeah, they've lost some tough games for sure. And I think you can question it at points, but like that was tough, and this is a good Penn State defensive line that pretty much knew you were going to run the ball. To start that drive with the quarterback sneak that picks up, I believe it was 5 yards. Let me pull that up. Yeah, Will Howard for gain of 4 is what they gave them. But, to start it like that behind this offensive line and then to, keep it going. I think there's only one play in that drive. Yeah, one play, if you don't count the kneel down at the end. 2nd and 3, Travion Henderson was stopped for no gain. Other than that, every play gained at least 2 yards on that drive, running the ball, all those things. So, for me, the fact that you were able to assert your will on either side of the ball there to end the game is not only important to win that game, but going forward, Ryan Day, I talked about this in a story that'll go up here later this afternoon, but, Ryan Day talks about winning games in the fourth quarter. And if you're going to be upset that you didn't win the game in the fourth quarter at Oregon, to respond this way and add in the Nebraska game. And I know you didn't want to be in a fourth quarter game against Nebraska, but you were, and you were losing in the fourth quarter and you had to go and win it. Those I think will be important learning moments for this team as you head into Indiana in a few weeks. Even Michigan, which will probably be a tougher game than it should because it's a rivalry game. The Big Ten championship game, likely a rematch with Oregon. Any college football playoff game. All of those things, you will need to you need to know at least that you can do what you did against Penn State. You hope that you don't have to use that tool in your bag, right? You hope that you're able to get a lead, but a lead that doesn't require that. But if you get in those situations, now you've got experience and good experience. If it had just been the Oregon game where, yeah, you moved the ball and you did some good things, but you lost, that doesn't carry as much weight, I don't think, to carry forward into some of those big games that are coming down the road. If there's a negative thing I'm taking out of the game, it's that for the second time in these top 5 games, the Buckeyes have opportunities to go up multiple scores and make it not a game anymore, and they can't take it. And, I'm sitting there, I'm talking to some of the guys around me, and like that was the conversation we were having was like, all right, start of a drive. Here's the opportunity. Can you go and go up 2 scores? And then for one reason or another, the Buckeyes just weren't able to do it. It's the same against Oregon. It was just, over and over, you're frustrated if you're the Buckeyes because like the opportunity is there. In Eugene, you could have gone up in that third quarter, could have gone up 2 scores. If Will Howard doesn't fumble that snap, you're moving the ball, fumbles the snap on 3rd and 3. All right, now you got a punt. Oregon comes back. We all know what happens. Against Penn State, similar things multiple times. You get the ball with an opportunity to go up, and I won't make you relive the whole every play, but it was, it was certainly, there were certainly some frustrating moments of like, why can't Ohio State get this to, a couple scores here? And I think that's something that the Buckeyes need to focus on for these future games, because if those at some point you've got to take those opportunities, and especially with this expanded college football playoff, Brad and I were just talking about maybe some of the matchups in terms of the projections right now. I think some of those games, maybe it's not a top 5 game that you're in, but you're playing a BYU or Boise State. Sorry, you're playing a Boise State or a Miami or somebody like that. Like, you've got to take opportunities to go up on a team like that you're better than, this isn't a top 5 game, but still a playoff game. Like those, that has to be something the Buckeyes are working on, that you need to get better, especially over these next few weeks when you have a couple games here where they are very winnable. And then that's the final thing. I think we need to talk about the Buckeyes going forward. You've just won this big game. Now, how do you respond? What do you do to respond? I think we don't want to see any kind of letdown, right? As a Buckeye fan, you can't allow these next 2 weeks to start creating questions about this team again. This needs to be a building block win where you look over these next 2 weeks before you play Indiana like the number 2 team in the country. And, that means just doing the same things that you did to win at Penn State. I want to see improvement on this offensive line. Just keep with this 5, which I assume is what the Buckeyes will stay with based on what Ryan Day said. Okay, let's build on that. How can we get better? Get Donovan Jackson, have him start looking more comfortable as a left tackle over these next couple weeks. Carson Hinsman played really well. Let's do it again. That group, just the chemistry continuing to develop. Will Howard cleaning up some of these mistakes that those mistakes didn't cost you against Penn State. Can you be turnover free for 2 straight weeks against 2 teams that you should be against? Because they're probably not going to force it. And look, if something weird happens, a tipped ball because a receiver doesn't look, something like that, I'm not going to hold that against Will Howard. But, throwing into triple coverage and getting picked off, for instance, let's not do that against Purdue or Northwestern. Defensively, it seems that the Buckeyes have turned a corner. Now, this is still a top 5 defensive team, but the issues from the Oregon game that could have become bigger cracks in the armor, those seem to have been cleaned up to an extent. Now, I will say, Nebraska, not a great offense. Penn State, good offense in certain ways in terms of some of the stuff they do. Tyler Warren, who the Buckeyes did a great job on. The running backs, which the Buckeyes did a good job on. 2 quarterbacks, all that. But they don't test you outside a ton. The wide receivers aren't elite. So you will see better matchups or more difficult matchups, I should say. But can, step by step, more of this Jim Knowles defense that I think we're starting to see, kind of more in his vision than maybe we were earlier in the year. That needs to continue over these next 2 weeks. Can you force more turnovers? Can you get another shutout in Big Ten play against 2 teams that are not good offensively? Things like that, I think would help you build confidence and whatnot heading into the final 2 games and Indiana. So that's kind of my thoughts coming out of the Penn State game. I do think the Purdue game, Ryan Day was talking about, you can't take Purdue lightly. And I understand as a head coach, you have to say that. This is a Purdue team that has 1 win this year, and it came against Indiana State in week 1. Since then, yes, they went to overtime against Illinois back on, what date was that? October 12th. So a few weeks ago, same day Ohio State played Oregon. But, other than that, 66-7 against Notre Dame, 38-21 Oregon State, 28-10 Nebraska, 52-6 Wisconsin, 35-0 against Oregon, and then losing in overtime to another bad team in Northwestern. So this is, it's not a non-conference game, but it should kind of feel like that on Saturday. And yeah, Ryan Day makes a point. They run 2 quarterbacks. The offense is interesting to some degree, but let's see where's Purdue ranked here. 112th in total offense, averaging 334.8 yards per game, and 119th in scoring offense, averaging 20.3 points per game. So yeah, they do some interesting things. You got to be ready for both quarterbacks, stuff like that. But this should not be a game that really tests Ohio State. This should be a game that you go out, you get the job done early, and you head into next week with your guys fresh and ready because the starters came out of the game early. It gives you some chance to work on some things, continue to build, all of that stuff. So that's what this needs to be. I will probably echo some of this next week against Northwestern. Obviously, that game's on the road and in a baseball stadium, which I'm excited for, but we'll talk about that next week. But I think you just got to go out and handle business as the number 2 team in the country. Look like the number 2 team in the country. Don't allow any reason for the committee to think, ooh, maybe we got that one wrong. Maybe Georgia deserves to be there, or maybe Ohio State's not quite what we thought because all of a sudden you take teams too lightly or whatever the case may be. Go handle your business. You got 4 games left in the regular season. These are the 2 easiest games you've got on your schedule. Go out there and dominate. It's as simple as that, at least in my mind. All right. I'm going to wrap it up. I will say the headline coming out of Saturday, when you read on Bucknuts Saturday afternoon, evening, night, the headline from the Purdue game, I think will be something like Buckeyes backup ranking, dominate Purdue. I've thought about it a lot this week in terms of, I think throughout the week, I always am thinking about what I'm going to do prediction wise. Obviously, we don't publish that on Bucknuts until Friday in the roundtable, but shutout. Like I said, I was reading you those scores. Purdue has been shut out once by Oregon. Once by Oregon. They scored 6 points against Wisconsin and had 7 points, 1 touchdown against Notre Dame. So you're the best defense in the country. Let's see it. Let's see it. But I think you will. I will. You'll see on Friday whether I go shutout or not. I haven't decided on that. But anyway, Buckeye fans, thanks for tuning in for this episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I know we went a little shorter than we normally do. This was a weird week. I wanted to get Brad on. Scheduling stuff changed, so we had to kind of improvise here and do this a little earlier in the week and whatnot. And I've got to get some things done before we head over to interviews. So a little bit shorter than we normally do, but I appreciate you all tuning in. We'll be back next week. I will be back on here with Dave after the game on Saturday for what we learned live. And there will be plenty more on Bucknuts. Stay tuned for the interviews tonight. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon, so Wednesday evening interviews with players. And enjoy this game. I have no beard to cheers, so we'll just end with a cheers. Thank you all again. I appreciate you, Brad, everybody for coming on and listening, watching, talking, all of the above. Cheers, Buckeye fans.